So I think that's sort of a good definition of the problem. Are you ready to shift to sort of, do you want to talk a little bit more about that, or are you ready to shift focus a little?
Let's shift. What do
Okay.
you think, viewers? Not that you have a choice, because you're going to be watching this recorded.
um, so part of what Christopher and I were sort of reflecting about before we started recording was that there's a really rich history in our tradition of God changing rapidly, or God introducing change rapidly, or God resisting the sort of tendency that we have to nail God to one place or to one way of thinking or to one practice.
Hmm.
Um, we can think, um, just to sort of begin talking about it, uh, there's God's name in the Old Testament, um, which, when you go back to the story of Moses and the burning bush, Moses asks, the God in this burning bush for God's name, and God says, essentially, I am who I am. You don't
Right.
you don't get to say, you don't get to call me a name, because you know giving God a name was sort of claiming God and nailing down God's essence, rather than letting God be who God was going to be.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, certain inability to fully pronounce the name was resistance to being circumscribed by it, right?
mhm. And we see this a little bit sort of in our own social lives. This phenomenon where, when we name something, we kind of claim it and make it familiar and tame it a little bit. I've got pet names for my wife and my son. Uh, People that know me really well call me by a different name than people who don't know me really well. And it's all part of that sort of subconscious mechanism whereby, if we feel like, if we can name something and give it a special name that belongs only to us, then it belongs to us and it's safe and it's not going to turn on us, right? Um,
Familiarity to it. Yeah.
and God has always been resistant to that tendency in us, even from the very first time that God made God's self known. Uh, and I think that in and of itself can sort of act as an entryway for us in what we're doing right now, right? Like, God's not in the building. Um, or, I mean, God is in the building, but God's not just in the building. And we can't, um, and God resists being claimed, and resists being familiar, because God is always sort of other and always new and always um, living.
Yeah, I mean, there's a forward moving nature to whatever it is we mean by the word God, right? Um, that to encounter God is never even really to encounter a return, but encounter opening to something new, even if that opening comes through familiar things, right? It's still fundamentally an invitation to something new. You were talking about naming. I think about all the different ways God is named in Scripture, and then I think also about the different ways that God is named and described by the prophets and the prophetic tradition, right? Who rail against the familiar, to use a broad category, and to talk about all the other ways God desires to be encountered, that God desires to be served and worshiped. Um, so if you want to talk about like people who were really open to this idea, the prophets were, and they engaged in those kinds of polemics much less gracefully than I think our conversation is going right now, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Um, and I also think, if we look back on our own history, um, as Christians, we were really quick, and almost until very recently, we were always very quick to claim the newest way of making God known, right? So
Mm,
if you think about, you know, when when people started to write in codices, right, in books instead of scrolls, like Christians were some of the very first to seize upon that as a way of getting all of the scriptural record into one place. When the printing press was discovered, the very first book was that was printed on it was the Holy Bible, right? We have the Gutenberg Bible that you can still see on at the library in New York City. Um, and it's only in the last, like, I don't know. I mean, communication has changed so much in the last century. It'd be hard for any group of people to keep up with it. But I mourn sometimes that we've lost the that drive to make God known as soon as new media types are available, right? Um, because there really has been a resistance, especially in the last century, to making God known on video or making God known, um,
Yeah.
specifically on the internet or using long distance means of communication.
Yeah, I was thinking about this too.